Madeline balanced her phone between her shoulder and ear while tossing slices of apples into a plastic container. Ivy, perched on a stool, kicked her feet against the cabinets, humming a song from the cartoons she had watched that morning. The apartment smelled like peanut butter and fabric softener, though the scent did little to make the cramped space feel less suffocating. The rent was past due again. "I don't have time for this," she muttered into the phone, squeezing her eyes shut as the building manager listed off the final warning in that impersonal, matter-of-fact tone landlords had perfected. "I just need a little more time." His sigh crackled through the speaker. "You've had time, Madeline. It's been 2 months. If you don't have the money by Friday, I have no choice but to start eviction proceedings." Her throat tightened as she glanced at Ivy, who was busy tucking her dolls into a makeshift bed of dish towels. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "I'll figure something out." Hanging up, she exhaled slowly, pressing a palm to her forehead. That was the problem, wasn't it? There was nothing left to figure out. She was already working double shifts at the diner and filling in at the bookstore whenever someone called out sick. Even with all that, the money just wasn't enough. Bianca's voice cut through her thoughts, cheerful and oblivious. "You look like you need wine. Or an exorcism." Madeline turned to find her best friend leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, blonde curls spilling over her shoulders like she belonged in some glossy lifestyle magazine instead of this peeling paint apartment. Bianca had an answer for everything, most of which involved shortcuts that made Madeline nervous. "I need a miracle," she muttered, tightening the lid on Ivy's lunchbox. Bianca plucked an unopened envelope from the counter and waved it like a victory flag. "This looks like bad news." "Tell me it's not bad news." Madeline snatched it from her. "It's bad news." Bianca groaned. "Okay, it's official. We're doing this my way." That sentence makes me deeply uncomfortable. "Just listen," Bianca said, already typing something on her phone. "There's a charity gala this weekend. Super exclusive. Fancy. Boring. But here's the good part, there's an auction where rich people bid on spending a day with someone for networking or whatever. It's not sketchy, it's not anything gross. You just show up, smile, and some corporate guy pays thousands to have lunch with you." Madeline scoffed, setting Ivy's backpack by the door. "You want me to sign up for rich people to bid on me like I'm a vintage purse?" Bianca didn't even blink. "Yes. And before you get all noble about it, they're paying just for participation. Whether someone bids on you or not, you walk out with a few thousand." That made Madeline pause. A few thousand. That was rent. That was groceries without clipping coupons. That was a month without choosing between gas for the car or keeping the lights on. Still, it felt ridiculous. "It sounds humiliating." Bianca grinned. "It sounds like free money." Ivy skipped over, wrapping her arms around Madeline's waist. "Mommy, can we have waffles tomorrow?" Madeline smoothed Ivy's curls, smiling despite the weight in her chest. "Maybe, sweetheart." Bianca nudged her. "Not maybe. Yes. Because you're coming with me Saturday, and you're leaving with a check." Madeline bit the inside of her cheek, looking around their tiny kitchen, the scuffed linoleum, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She hated it. Hated how she was always scraping by, how Ivy deserved better. Maybe just this once, Bianca was right. She let out a slow breath. "Okay. But if I regret this, I get to say, 'I told you so,' for a year." Bianca laughed, slinging an arm around her shoulders. "Deal. Now, let's talk dresses." The ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the kind that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than dangling above a room full of people holding champagne flutes and wearing expressions of effortless wealth. Waiters floated between tables carrying silver trays of oysters and miniature lobster rolls, while guests, dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns, engaged in conversation that likely involved stock portfolios and offshore accounts. Madeline felt like she had wandered into a parallel universe where money wasn't just something people had, but something they barely thought about. She tugged at the fabric of her borrowed gown, a sleek navy dress Bianca had insisted was chic but understated. It fit perfectly, which meant Bianca had definitely lied when she said she randomly picked it out of her closet. Bianca, standing beside her, looked like she belonged here, draped in emerald silk and wearing heels that could double as weapons. "This is insane," Madeline whispered, scanning the room. "People are bidding thousands of dollars on things they could just buy." "That's the point," Bianca murmured back, barely moving her lips as she sipped her cocktail. "It's not about getting the thing. It's about being the kind of person who throws money at something just because they can." Madeline's gaze swept over the stage at the front of the room, where an auctioneer in a sharp tuxedo was guiding the crowd through the current lot, a private cooking class with a world-renowned chef, which was already sitting at $20,000. A woman in an emerald dress, apparently very committed to her love of risotto, raised her paddle, bumping the bid up by another $5,000. Madeline swallowed. She had agreed to this. She had signed up for the auction, let the organizers take her picture, write up a blurb about how she was a dedicated working mother offering a day of engaging company. She had done all of it because it was supposed to be easy. Smile, let some businessmen with too much disposable income pay for an afternoon of polite conversation, and walk away with enough money to keep her life from falling apart. But standing there now, watching people bid enough money to pay off her entire year's rent just to drink wine and knead pasta dough, she started to wonder if she had made a very big mistake. Bianca nudged her. "You're up soon." Madeline exhaled, smoothing her palms over the dress. The current auction item, a weekend in Paris with a private driver and 5-star accommodations, had just closed at $65,000. The auctioneer was beaming, clearly thrilled to be raking in absurd amounts of money for charity. "And now, for the highlight of the evening," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the murmuring crowd. "Our volunteer experiences, where you generous bidders get the chance to spend a day with some of our wonderful participants, who have graciously offered their time in support of tonight's cause." Applause rippled through the room as a screen behind the stage flickered to life, displaying images of the volunteers. Their names, professions, and carefully curated descriptions scrolled past: an architect, a marine biologist, a best-selling author. Madeline's picture appeared, her bio neatly summarizing her as a dedicated single mother and community advocate. She was going to kill Bianca. "Madeline Hayes," the auctioneer continued, gesturing toward the side of the stage where she was expected to walk out. "A hardworking mother balancing 2 jobs while raising her 6-year-old daughter. She's offering an afternoon of great conversation and insight into her inspiring daily life." Inspiring? She barely had time to eat a meal sitting down. Bianca gave her a gentle shove. "Go." Madeline took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, and for a brief moment, she felt like she had walked straight into a dream, the kind where you suddenly realize you're in front of a crowd and have no idea what you're supposed to be doing. But she kept walking, kept her posture straight, kept her expression calm even as her heart slammed against her ribs. The auctioneer smiled at her, then turned back to the audience. "Who will start the bidding?" A paddle shot up. A man in his 50s, silver hair, a designer suit that probably cost more than her car. 5,000. Her stomach unclenched slightly. This was fine. It was all for charity, after all. Another bid. Then another. The numbers climbed steadily, 10,000, 15,000. She kept a pleasant smile on her face, even as Bianca, standing at the edge of the crowd, gave her a thumbs up like this was a totally normal situation. Then the auctioneer said something that made the room go very still. "And of course," he added, voice smooth, "this unique experience will last for 1 full year." Madeline's mouth went dry. She blinked, certain she had misheard. But the crowd didn't react with shock. They laughed, a warm, indulgent chuckle that told her they thought this was all some kind of joke. Except the numbers kept rising. 25,000. 30. She took a half step forward, instinct telling her to say something, to fix whatever mistake had just happened, but the auctioneer was already grinning. We have 35,000, do I hear 40? A new bidder joined in. Madeline's pulse thundered in her ears. This is a mistake, she finally managed to say, her voice lower than she intended. The auctioneer either didn't hear her or didn't care. She turned her head slightly, scanning for Bianca, but her friend looked just as startled, her eyes wide, fingers hovering near her lips like she had just realized she might have gotten Madeline into something much worse than an awkward lunch. Another bid. 45,000. She had to stop this. She had to. 50,000. The room hushed. The voice was deep, calm, unhurried. It belonged to a man sitting toward the back, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his tie knotted with precise care. Something about him made her stomach twist, though she couldn't quite name why. The auctioneer turned to him, clearly pleased. 50,000 going once. Madeline stepped forward. There's been a misunderstanding. A ripple of laughter. The auctioneer grinned. Going twice. Wait. Sold. The gavel struck the podium, and the ballroom erupted into applause. Madeline's hands curled at her sides, her pulse an erratic drumbeat. The man, whoever he was, stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the back exit, vanishing into the sea of people. Bianca appeared beside her a second later, whispering urgently, "Okay." Slight change of plans. Madeline exhaled sharply. Slight? Okay, Major. But it's still money. The auctioneer, beaming, gestured for her to step down, already moving on to the next volunteer. Madeline's heart pounded as she let Bianca pull her toward the side entrance, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. She had agreed to one afternoon. Somehow, she had just been sold for a year. Madeline stared at the auctioneer, her mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just said. A year? That wasn't what she had signed up for. She had agreed to an afternoon, one lunch, maybe a museum tour, an hour of pleasant small talk with a man who wanted to feel philanthropic. That was all. But a year? She must have misheard. That had to be it. She took a small, steadying breath and turned slightly toward the auctioneer, schooling her expression into something polite but firm. I think there's been a mistake. He didn't even glance at her, too busy grinning at the crowd. 50,000. Do I hear 55? Laughter rippled through the ballroom, light and indulgent, the kind that came from people who had never made a budgeting spreadsheet in their lives. This was entertainment to them, a break from the usual art and jewelry auctions. It was clear they thought the mix-up was intentional, part of the show. She took another step forward, hands clenched at her sides. No, really, this isn't right. I only signed up for 55,000, the auctioneer announced, beaming. A man near the front, with an impressive collection of gold rings and an even more impressive lack of concern, lifted his paddle higher. Her stomach dropped. Bianca, standing at the edge of the stage, was staring at her with an expression that fell somewhere between horror and the kind of breathless amusement she usually reserved for reality TV fights. Madeline turned back to the auctioneer, her voice sharper this time. I need to. 60,000. The crowd erupted into cheers. The paddle belonged to a man in his early 60s, his tuxedo crisp, his expression smug, as though he had just bid on a racehorse and was pleased with his selection. Madeline's pulse pounded in her ears. This was spiraling, and fast. She lifted a hand, trying again. There's been a 70,000. This time the voice came from the back. Low. Unhurried. The sound cut through the noise, silencing the murmurs almost instantly. The man leaned back in his seat, his movements deliberate, calculated. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, the kind of precision that came from wealth so deeply ingrained it didn't need to announce itself. His expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the stage with a quiet confidence that sent a new wave of panic rushing through Madeline's chest. She didn't know him. At least, she didn't think she did. But something about him made her uneasy. The auctioneer, delighted by the drama unfolding, practically vibrated with excitement. 70. Do I hear 75? A brief pause. The man in the tuxedo hesitated, then shook his head, lips pressed into a thin line. The auctioneer clapped his hands together. 70,000, going once. Madeline turned, eyes pleading, searching for someone, anyone, who would listen. Bianca, now mouthing "oh my God" at her like this was the most interesting thing that had ever happened, was clearly useless. Going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. The applause was thunderous. Glasses clinked, guests laughed, and Madeline stood frozen in place, her nails digging into her palms. Bianca appeared at her side in an instant, gripping her arm with far too much enthusiasm. That was incredible. That was a disaster, Madeline hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. A year, Bianca. A year. Bianca waved a dismissive hand. You don't know that. It's probably just some mix-up in the wording. He's not actually going to make you be his assistant for a year. Madeline had seen enough contracts in her life to know that rich people took fine print very seriously. She let Bianca steer her toward the side entrance, her heart still hammering as she cast a final glance at the man in the back of the room. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even talking to anyone. He just watched her leave, calm, collected, unreadable. She didn't know why, but that made her panic even more. Laughter rippled through the ballroom, glasses clinking in celebration as the auctioneer's gavel struck the podium. Madeline stood frozen on the stage, her pulse roaring in her ears, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails pressed into her palms. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She turned her head slightly, scanning the sea of faces, searching for Bianca. Her friend was still standing near the edge of the crowd, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with the kind of horrified fascination people usually reserved for car crashes or reality TV. Then movement at the back of the room caught her attention. A man stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, but there was something about the way the space around him shifted, like people instinctively knew to make way. He wasn't in a rush. He had known, from the moment he'd placed his bid, that he would win. Julian Mercer. His name meant nothing to her, but it clearly meant something to everyone else in the room. A few murmurs passed between guests, hushed and intrigued, as he stepped away from his table, his pace measured, controlled. He exuded the kind of effortless confidence that came with old money, the kind of power that wasn't flashy but was still impossible to ignore. One of the men sitting near him, someone equally well-dressed but far looser in demeanor, clapped him on the back, laughing. Didn't think you'd actually do it. Julian's gaze didn't waver from the stage. Neither did I. His voice was calm, deep, unbothered. It made her uneasy. The auctioneer beamed, clearly pleased that the event's highlight had turned into such a spectacle. Congratulations, Mr. Mercer, he said, gesturing toward Madeline as if she were a prize on a game show. A full year of dedicated assistance. I'm sure you'll find her a wonderful addition to your team. Madeline found her voice, though it came out sharper than she intended. That's not what I agreed to. The crowd laughed again. She took a step forward, pulse hammering. There's been a mistake. The auctioneer barely glanced at her. I assure you, everything has been handled according to the contract. Her stomach twisted. Julian had reached the edge of the stage by now, watching the exchange with a mild sort of interest. He didn't look entertained, didn't look particularly amused by her panic. If anything, he seemed neutral. Unmoved. Like this entire situation wasn't odd at all. She turned to him, grasping onto the one thing she still had, logic. You don't actually expect me to be your assistant for a year. Julian tilted his head slightly. That was the auction's offer. It was a mistake. Perhaps. He slid his hands into his pockets, his gaze steady. But it's already been finalized. The auctioneer nodded along enthusiastically. That's right. The contract has been processed. Everything is official. Panic tightened in her chest. She looked at Julian, searching for any sign of reason, some indication that he wasn't actually going to hold her to this absurd agreement. But his face remained unreadable, a mask of quiet detachment. She turned back toward the crowd, toward Bianca, but her friend wasn't where she had been before. Instead, Bianca was suddenly behind the curtain near the stage entrance, wide-eyed and waving frantically for Madeline to follow her. A warm hand pressed against her back, guiding her down the small set of stairs leading off stage. Come along, Miss Hayes, one of the event coordinators said with a forced smile. We'll finalize the details backstage. She didn't move right away. Julian was still standing near the stage, watching her. Not in the way the crowd had watched, full of amusement and indulgence, but with something quieter. Calculated. She turned, forcing herself to walk, to move before her body locked up completely. The moment the curtain closed behind her, Bianca grabbed her wrist. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely contained. Slight complication. Slight? Madeline yanked her arm free, her pulse erratic. A year, Bianca. I know. Bianca chewed her lip, looking entirely too fascinated for someone who should have been just as horrified. But it's just words on paper. Nobody actually expects you to. Miss Hayes. A woman in a navy blue blazer, all business, all sharp efficiency, appeared from behind a small desk, a folder already open in her hands. If you'll just sign here, we'll make it all official. Madeline stared at the paperwork. The contract. The legally binding contract. She swallowed hard. This isn't enforceable. It was a mistake. The woman smiled in the way only event coordinators and customer service representatives could. The terms were listed in the auction pamphlet. Every bidder agreed to them before the event. I didn't agree to them. The consent form you signed at registration states that all auction winners will be granted full access to the experience purchased. That's incredibly vague. The woman's smile didn't falter. That's the language used in all charity events of this nature. Madeline glanced at Bianca, who winced. Julian had entered the space now, standing a few feet away, listening but not interrupting. Madeline's voice was tight. This isn't happening. Julian finally spoke. You'd rather I rescind the bid? Something about the way he said it, like it was a genuine question rather than a challenge, sent another wave of unease through her. Of course, she wanted him to take it back. Of course, she wanted this to be over. But there was something about the certainty in his voice, the way he seemed to already know her answer, that made her hesitate. $70,000. That was what he had spent on this. That was what she was supposed to walk away with. That was more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. She exhaled slowly. Bianca, to her credit, didn't say anything. Didn't push her to take it, didn't try to argue. Madeline turned to the woman at the desk. What are the terms? The woman flipped a page. Standard assistant duties. No obligations beyond standard professional expectations. Nothing else? The woman shook her head. Julian's expression didn't change. Madeline swallowed down the rising uncertainty in her throat. She had agreed to this auction because she had needed a way out of the mess she was in. A way to keep Ivy's life from crumbling, to buy herself more time, to keep everything from spiraling further than it already had. She had told herself it was just a few hours of polite conversation. Now, it was a year. But it was also $70,000. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pen. The private lounge was quieter than the rest of the venue, the distant hum of the gala fading behind thick velvet curtains and polished mahogany doors. The lighting was softer here, warm sconces casting long shadows over deep leather chairs and a bar stocked with bottles that probably cost more than her entire rent. A waiter in a crisp white jacket moved silently across the room, setting down a tray of champagne flutes on the marble-topped side table. Everything about the space screamed exclusivity, the kind of place where business deals were sealed with handshakes and people like her didn't belong. Madeline was too stunned to care. She stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, pulse thrumming unevenly in her throat. Across the room, Julian Mercer sat with an air of complete control, his movements smooth, effortless, as though this entire situation were nothing more than an interesting detour in his evening. He glanced at his watch. Not impatient, not irritated. Just waiting. The weight of recognition settled over her like a physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs. She knew him. Not from the news, not from some magazine headline about a self-made billionaire or the city's most eligible bachelor. No, she knew him in a way that had nothing to do with boardrooms or stock prices. He was Ivy's father. The realization sent a sharp wave of nausea through her. Julian Mercer. She had spent years wondering if she would ever see him again, imagining what she would say, if she would say anything at all. She had thought about it in the quiet moments after Ivy had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness of their tiny apartment, replaying the night she had met him, the way he had disappeared from her life without knowing what he had left behind. And now here he was, sitting less than 10 feet away, completely unaware of who she was. She hadn't been expecting this. A rich man, yes. A stranger, definitely. But not him. The irony would have been almost funny if it didn't feel like she was drowning. Julian studied her, his expression unreadable. He didn't look surprised, which made sense. He didn't know who she was. "Miss Hayes," he said finally, the syllables measured, deliberate. His voice was just as she remembered, low, smooth, with that quiet confidence that made people listen when he spoke. She swallowed hard, gripping her arms tighter. "You don't recognize me." His gaze flickered over her face, assessing. If there was any hint of familiarity, he didn't show it. Should I? Something inside her cracked. Of course he didn't. To him, she was just a name on a contract, a transaction, another person who would enter his life briefly and leave just as easily. The fact that they had history, real history, meant nothing to him. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to push back the panic rising in her chest. He didn't know. And for now, she wasn't going to tell him. The memory came rushing back, uninvited, vivid in a way that made her stomach tighten. 7 years ago, she had been standing behind a different bar, in a hotel so extravagant it barely felt real. She had taken the job because the tips were good and the customers were too rich to care about their tab. She had been younger, less tired, and still believed that life could change overnight, that something unexpected could sweep her off her feet and land her somewhere better. That night, the lounge had been packed with executives celebrating the close of some massive deal, their laughter thick with the kind of ease that came from knowing they would never have to check their bank balances. Julian had been among them, but he hadn't been like the rest. He hadn't been the loudest or the drunkest or the type to flash his wealth like a neon sign. He had sat at the end of the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he didn't care, but not so much that he looked disheveled. She had noticed him before he had spoken a word. There was something about him, controlled, unreadable, like he was always 3 steps ahead of the room. And then, as if sensing her eyes on him, he had looked up. "You don't belong here." It hadn't been a pickup line. More of an observation. But there had been something behind it, something that made her lean against the bar and tilt her head. "And where do I belong?" she had asked, half amused, half intrigued. He had taken a slow sip of his drink before answering. "Somewhere better." She had laughed. "Do you say that to all the bartenders?" He had smiled then, small, almost imperceptible. "No." The night had unfolded from there, effortless, like they had known each other for years instead of hours. He had been sharp, but not unkind, direct but not pushy. She had liked that about him. She had liked the way he listened, the way he didn't treat her like she was just someone passing him a drink. He had asked about her life, her plans, what she wanted beyond this job, and she had told him things she hadn't told anyone. And then, somewhere between last call and sunrise, she had ended up in his hotel suite, the city glowing beneath them, the air thick with something that felt too big to just be one night. But that's all it had been. The next morning, he had been gone. No note, no awkward goodbyes. Just an empty space where he had been. She had told herself she wasn't surprised. People like him didn't stay. She hadn't thought about it much after that, hadn't let herself wonder where he had gone, what deal had pulled him to the other side of the world. She had gone back to work, back to her life, back to everything that had been there before him. Until 6 weeks later, when she had stared down at the pregnancy test in her tiny apartment, the reality of it sinking into her bones like cement. She had never meant to keep it from him. At least, not at first. She had called the hotel, but he was long gone. She had searched his name online, but Julian Mercer was everywhere: magazine features, business articles, stockholder meetings. A man constantly in motion. A man impossible to reach. And then, as time passed, she had convinced herself it didn't matter. He had left without a word. He had moved on, and so had she. She had built a life, one where she was both mother and father, where she carried every burden and every joy without expecting anyone else to share the weight. And now, standing in front of him after all these years, watching him sip his whiskey like nothing had changed, like she was just another face in a long line of forgettable interactions, she had no idea what to do. She could tell him. She could say it now, drop it between them like a grenade and watch his perfect composure crack. She could tell him about Ivy, about the little girl who had his dark eyes and stubborn determination, about the years he had missed, the moments he would never get back. But what if he didn't care? What if it changed nothing? Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, the weight of the decision pressing against her ribs. She had spent years keeping this part of her life locked away, convinced she had done the right thing. Now, she wasn't so sure. Julian leaned back in his chair, watching Madeline with the detached interest of a man who had spent his entire life negotiating deals that others couldn't afford to walk away from. He had the patience of someone who always got what he wanted in the end, a man who never needed to raise his voice because the weight of his name did the work for him. The silence between them stretched, and Madeline felt the absurdity of the moment settle deeper into her bones. She had spent the last few years budgeting down to the last dollar, praying that her car wouldn't die, and now she was sitting in a private lounge with Julian Mercer, a billionaire real estate mogul who had just purchased her services for $70,000. Julian didn't seem particularly impressed with her. He regarded her the way one might regard a new employee who was already failing to meet expectations. "I assume you read the terms before you agreed to the auction," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. She exhaled sharply, gripping the arms of her chair. "No. Because the terms I agreed to were for an afternoon. Not a year." He lifted an eyebrow, unconcerned. "Then you should have read the fine print." She clenched her teeth. Julian had built his empire on details, on contracts that left no room for ambiguity. Mercer Enterprises was one of the largest real estate firms in the country, a company that built five-star hotels and luxury residential towers in cities where space itself was a form of currency. He was known for being ruthless, a man who turned struggling neighborhoods into high-end developments and made billions in the process. His father had started the business decades ago, a man infamous for treating people as assets, measuring relationships in their ability to turn a profit. Julian had taken that foundation and made it bigger. Stronger. Colder. She had read about him in the years after Ivy was born. Not on purpose, he was simply unavoidable. His name showed up in headlines, on finance blogs, in magazine spreads about the young, brilliant CEO who had transformed Mercer Enterprises into a global powerhouse. But reading about him and sitting across from him now were two very different things. "You don't actually expect me to work for you for a year," she said, keeping her voice steady. "That's exactly what I expect." She leaned forward, pressing her hands against the table between them. "I'm not your employee. I don't belong to you." He didn't blink. "No one said you did." She hated the way he was looking at her. Not cruelly. Not even unkindly. Just as if she were an unfortunate logistical problem. "This isn't how these things work," she argued. He set his glass down, finally looking somewhat interested in the conversation. "Then tell me how they work." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because the truth was, she didn't know. She had let Bianca talk her into this, convinced it was harmless, an easy solution to her financial mess. But she hadn't thought past the part where she would show up in a dress and smile through dinner. She had assumed the highest bidder would be some bored hedge fund manager looking for a conversation piece at his next social event, not a man like Julian, who had turned it into a transaction as binding as a merger agreement. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "I have a daughter." Julian's expression didn't change. And I don't have time to play your assistant. I have responsibilities." "Then you should have considered that before you stepped onto that stage." Anger flared, hot and sharp. "Maybe you should have considered that before bidding on someone who didn't actually sign up for this." Julian exhaled, as if her frustration was an inconvenience more than anything else. "The contract is legally binding." She gritted her teeth. "So you keep saying." He held her gaze, unyielding. She refused to be the one to look away. There was a pause, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression, and then he stood, buttoning his jacket with an easy, practiced motion. "You start Monday." Her stomach dropped. "Are you serious?" He didn't answer, just glanced at his watch before stepping past her, his presence leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and inevitability. The door shut behind him with quiet finality. Madeline sat there, her hands curled into fists. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to scream or laugh. Madeline stared at him, disbelief tightening in her chest. The words had left Julian's mouth so easily, so carelessly, as if she were nothing more than an incompetent employee trying to get out of a shift. "You should have thought of that before signing up." She blinked, feeling the sharp sting of those words settle deep, burning hot and unfair. A slow wave of something acrid rose in her throat, and she had to remind herself to breathe. "You really think I signed up for this?" Her voice was quiet, but steady, controlled, though every muscle in her body screamed at her to throw something, to shatter the carefully constructed tension between them with the force of her rage. Julian barely looked up from the contract in his hand, as if this conversation was already boring him. That's usually how auctions work. Her nails dug into her palms. "I agreed to one afternoon. One. Not 12 months at your beck and call." He sighed, finally lifting his gaze to hers. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of something deeper beneath the cool detachment. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him. Tell him everything. About the night they met, about the baby she had carried alone, about the little girl waiting at home who had his same dark eyes, the same sharp determination in her tiny frame. But she didn't. Because if she did, she would have to face the possibility that it wouldn't matter. That he wouldn't care. Madeline pushed back her chair with more force than necessary and stood. You know what? Enjoy your new assistant. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, fury pulsing through every step. She didn't stop until she reached the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly as if sheer impatience could make it arrive faster. The doors finally opened, and she stepped inside, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, breathing hard. Bianca was waiting for her outside the hotel, eyes wide as she hurried toward her. So, how did it go? Did you tell him? Madeline let out a sharp laugh, one that didn't contain a trace of humor. Oh, I told him something, all right. Bianca tilted her head. Meaning? Meaning I quit. Bianca stared at her. Wait, what? Madeline yanked open the car door and slid into the driver's seat, her pulse still hammering. Forget it, Bianca. This was a mistake. A huge, catastrophic mistake. Bianca slid into the passenger seat, still looking stunned. But, $70,000, Maddie. She gripped the steering wheel, her jaw tight. Bianca leaned in slightly. Did he recognize you? A muscle in Madeline's cheek twitched. Bianca exhaled. Wow. Okay. So, no. She shook her head once, sharp and decisive. No. Bianca hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. And you didn't tell him about Ivy? Madeline turned the key in the ignition. No. The car filled with silence, thick and suffocating. Bianca shifted uncomfortably. So, what now? Madeline pulled out onto the street, the hotel fading into the background behind them. Now, I go home and figure out how to keep my landlord from throwing me and Ivy onto the street. Bianca was quiet for a moment, then said, or, you could take the job. Madeline let out a bitter laugh. Yeah. Sure. I'll just work for the world's least self-aware billionaire, who doesn't even remember knocking me up, while juggling motherhood and dealing with his impossible expectations. Sounds like a dream. Bianca tapped her fingers against the dashboard. Well, it sounds like $70,000. Madeline's hands tightened around the steering wheel. She knew Bianca was right. It was money. It was security. It was the difference between staying in their apartment or packing up what little they had and crashing on a friend's couch. But it was also Julian. And she wasn't sure which part of that terrified her more. Monday morning came faster than she wanted it to. The office was exactly what she expected, sleek, towering, the kind of place where everyone wore expensive shoes and spoke in hushed, businesslike tones. Madeline adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, shifting awkwardly as she waited for the elevator. She didn't belong here. She knew that. But she needed this paycheck, and if that meant suffering through Julian's cold, dismissive attitude, then so be it. The doors slid open, and she stepped inside, exhaling as she pressed the button for the top floor. The moment she stepped out, a polished brunette in a fitted blazer was waiting for her, iPad in hand. Miss Hayes, you're late. Madeline blinked. It's 8:58. The woman, who had the sharp efficiency of someone who had been running on caffeine deadlines for the last decade, arched a brow. Mr. Mercer expects his employees at their desks by 7:30. Of course, he did. She forced a tight smile. Noted. The woman turned on her heel. Follow me. Madeline hurried after her, taking in the vast expanse of Julian's office. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, a view that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. The furniture was minimalist, pristine, the kind of decor that looked nice but didn't invite comfort. Julian sat behind an enormous desk, flipping through paperwork, barely acknowledging her presence. The woman gestured toward her. Mr. Mercer, your new assistant is here. Julian didn't look up. Miss Hayes. Madeline crossed her arms. Mr. Mercer. He finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Your schedule is on your desk, the woman continued, tapping at her tablet. You'll find the list of priorities for the week. Deadlines are firm. Mr. Mercer prefers minimal distractions. Madeline exhaled through her nose. Of course, he does. The woman ignored her. Meetings begin promptly at 9. He expects all reports in hand beforehand. Your first task is to prepare the presentation for this afternoon's board meeting. Madeline blinked. I have no idea how to do that. Julian didn't look concerned. You'll figure it out. She stared at him. You do realize I'm not actually an assistant, right? That I have no experience with. I expect competence. His voice was calm, but final. I don't have time for anything else. Her jaw clenched. So this was how it was going to be. Fine. She had survived worse. She could survive this. She grabbed the folder off her desk and stalked toward the door. She didn't bother looking back. Madeline's life became a never-ending game of endurance, a balancing act where she was always on the verge of tipping over. Mornings were frantic, afternoons relentless, and nights filled with exhaustion so deep she felt it in her bones. She woke up before the sun, packing Ivy's lunch with one hand while checking Julian's schedule with the other. She printed reports while brushing Ivy's hair into a ponytail. She answered emails while shoving a piece of toast into her mouth. At the office, it was worse. Julian expected efficiency at an inhuman level. He spoke in clipped sentences, sent emails at all hours, and left no room for mistakes. Every task was urgent, every deadline unreasonable. He operated in a world where people had assistants for their assistants, where no one had to rush home to pick up a 6-year-old or worry about grocery lists and electricity bills. Madeline would check her phone between meetings, relief washing over her when she saw a text from Bianca saying Ivy was fine, that she had eaten dinner, that she had gone to bed without a fuss. But the relief never lasted long. Because as much as Bianca tried to help, it wasn't the same. It wasn't Madeline kissing Ivy goodnight or helping her with school projects or listening to her ramble about the book she was reading. Have you told him yet? Bianca asked one evening, perched on Madeline's couch as she folded tiny pairs of pajamas. Ivy was already asleep, curled up in her bed, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Madeline rubbed at her temples, her laptop open in front of her, an unfinished report glaring at her from the screen. Told who what? Bianca shot her a look. Julian. About Ivy. Madeline's fingers froze over the keyboard. Bianca sighed. Maddie. No. You can't just. I said no. She closed her laptop harder than necessary, standing abruptly. It's not an option. Bianca crossed her arms. Why? Madeline let out a sharp laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. Because he's Julian Mercer. Because he doesn't care about anything that doesn't make him money. Because he looked me right in the face and didn't remember me. Bianca didn't argue right away. She just watched her, eyes softer now. Madeline exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples. If I tell him, what happens then? He suddenly decides to play dad? What if he tries to take her away from me? What if he doesn't care at all? Bianca didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Madeline. The days blurred together after that, an endless cycle of emails, meetings, rushed dinners, and stolen moments with Ivy before bed. She told herself she was managing, that it was temporary, that she just had to keep going until she could figure out something better. And then, one night, everything crumbled. She was at the office later than usual, trapped in the glass-walled conference room as Julian went over a contract with his legal team. It was past 9, the city outside glittering in the dark, and her phone vibrated in her lap. Bianca. She hesitated, glancing at Julian. He was focused on the papers in front of him, oblivious to her presence. She answered quietly, keeping her voice low. "Hey, I'm in a meeting. Ivy has a fever." Bianca's voice was calm, but Madeline could hear the worry underneath. "It just started, but she's really warm." Madeline's stomach clenched. "Did she eat?" "Barely." She said her head hurts. A cold wave of guilt washed over her. She had noticed Ivy seemed quieter than usual that morning, but she had brushed it off, assuming it was just one of those days. "I'm coming." She hung up before Bianca could protest, shoving her laptop into her bag. Julian didn't look up. "Where are you going?" She slung her bag over her shoulder, barely sparing him a glance. "Home. We're not done here." She let out a sharp breath, her pulse pounding. "Then finish without me." Something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, maybe. Curiosity. She didn't care. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the weight of guilt pressing down on her with every step. By the time she got home, Ivy was curled up on the couch, cheeks flushed, her tiny body bundled in blankets. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice weak. Madeline sank to her knees, brushing Ivy's damp curls back from her forehead. "I'm here, baby." She pressed a kiss to her daughter's temple, the heat from her skin making Madeline's chest tighten. Bianca hovered nearby. "I gave her some medicine, but she just wants you." Madeline nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. She lifted Ivy gently, carrying her to bed, whispering soft reassurances against her hair. And when Ivy's breathing finally evened out, when the room was silent except for the quiet hum of the city outside, Madeline sat at the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. She had missed dinner. She had missed bedtime. And for what? A job that barely let her breathe. A man who didn't even remember her. The guilt was suffocating. She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. Something had to change. Madeline had barely slept. Ivy's fever had broken sometime before dawn, but that did little to soothe the exhaustion clawing at her. She had spent the night curled up next to her daughter, waking at every small shift, every tiny whimper, pressing the back of her hand against Ivy's forehead every hour to make sure the worst had passed. Now, the morning light streamed weakly through the curtains, and Madeline's body ached from staying in one position for too long. Her alarm buzzed from across the room, an obnoxious reminder that she was supposed to be at the office in an hour. She closed her eyes for a beat, trying to push away the crushing weight of reality. Ivy stirred, her small hand curling into Madeline's shirt. "Mommy, don't go," Ivy mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Madeline pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm not going anywhere, baby." She meant it. There was no way she was leaving Ivy today, no matter what Julian Mercer had to say about it. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and scrolled through her contacts, pressing call before she could overthink it. The line barely rang once before a clipped voice answered. "Mercer." Madeline exhaled sharply. "It's me. I'm not coming in today." A pause. Then, flatly, "Excuse me? Ivy is sick. I need to be home with her." Another silence. "That's not how this works." Her grip tightened around the phone. "I'm telling you as a courtesy. This isn't a negotiation. I'm not asking for permission." Julian let out a slow breath, the kind that suggested she was testing his patience. "Madeline, this job requires full commitment. If I let you take the day off every time something comes up, I'd have to extend the same courtesy to everyone else. And that's not how I run things." She clenched her jaw. "You say that like I'm asking for a vacation. Personal matters can't interfere with work." "She's my daughter," Madeline snapped. "Not a personal matter. This is what nannies are for." The words hit like a slap, so casually spoken it took her a second to register them. She let out a bitter laugh. Wow. That might be the most obnoxiously rich thing I've ever heard. Julian didn't respond, but she could picture his face, neutral, unreadable, unaffected. She pressed her fingers against her temple, trying to rein in her temper, but she was too tired, too strung out, and frankly, too angry to pretend she was fine with this. Let me make something very clear, she said, her voice sharp now. I am not one of your properties. I am not an investment. I am not some nameless assistant you can order around like a robot. I have a child, Julian. I have a life outside of your overpriced office. And I'm not going to sit here and let you act like it's a ridiculous inconvenience that I want to take care of my own daughter. Silence. Not the clipped, irritated kind. Not the impatient, I'm done with this kind. This one was different. Madeline paced the small space of Ivy's bedroom, gripping the phone so tightly she was sure she'd leave indentations on the case. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was different. Not softer, exactly. But different. I'll have the meeting notes sent to your email. She stopped pacing. She frowned. Because for once, Julian Mercer didn't sound like he had the last word. Madeline woke up still expecting a fight. She had gone to bed bracing for the inevitable battle waiting for her at the office, Julian's cold disapproval, the passive-aggressive emails, the unsubtle punishment of being buried under extra work. Maybe even outright termination. The thought had made her restless, but exhaustion had eventually won, and she had collapsed into sleep beside Ivy, her daughter's warm little body curled against her. Now, the early morning light filtered in through the curtains, and her phone was buzzing on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, rubbing her eyes as she read the message from Julian's assistant, the ever-efficient and vaguely terrifying Charlotte. Mr. Mercer has approved remote work for today. Expect a revised schedule by 8 a.m. Madeline blinked at the screen, reading the message again, then a third time, because clearly, she wasn't fully awake yet. She sat up slowly, her heart still braced for conflict. Julian had refused to even entertain the idea of flexibility before. He had scoffed at the notion of personal responsibilities. He had acted like a sick child was an inconvenience instead of a reason to adjust. And yet, here was the proof, staring back at her in neat, professional font. She wasn't going to question it. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of asking why he had changed his mind. She was just going to take the win. By the time she made it to the kitchen, Ivy was awake, curled up under a blanket on the couch, watching cartoons with a half-eaten bowl of cereal on her lap. Bianca had let herself in at some point and was leaning against the counter, sipping coffee, watching Madeline with raised brows. So? Bianca prompted, already knowing something was up. Madeline held up her phone. He's letting me work from home. Bianca nearly choked on her sip. I'm sorry, what? Madeline tossed her phone onto the table and reached for the coffee pot. I know. Bianca folded her arms. Julian Mercer. Your boss. The one who thinks feelings are an outdated concept. That Julian Mercer. Madeline exhaled, rubbing her forehead. Maybe he grew a conscience overnight. Bianca hummed. Or maybe someone yelled at him. Madeline took a slow sip of coffee and didn't say anything. That evening, another message arrived from Charlotte. Be ready by 7 p.m. Black tie attire required. Transportation will be provided. Madeline read it twice, then immediately called Bianca. What kind of black tie event are we talking about? She asked as soon as Bianca answered. Like, the kind where rich people sit around congratulating themselves on being rich? Or the kind where someone casually announces they've bought a small country? Bianca sounded way too excited. It's the corporate gala, isn't it? The one for the real estate industry? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Oh, it is, Bianca confirmed. I saw it on the news. Every billionaire with a god complex is going to be there. Madeline groaned, rubbing her temple. I don't own anything black tie. Lucky for you, I do. At exactly 7 p.m., a sleek town car pulled up in front of her building, and she stepped outside in a floor-length emerald gown that Bianca had assured her was sophisticated but also just revealing enough to make an ex jealous. Not that she cared about making Julian Mercer anything. She slid into the car, smoothing the fabric of her dress as Julian barely spared her a glance. You're late. You're rich. Buy yourself some patience. He didn't respond, but she caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, and she refused to acknowledge the tiny thrill it gave her. The gala was exactly what she expected, over the top, extravagant, the kind of event where people drank champagne that cost more than her rent and pretended to care about things like charity while bidding on rare art. Julian moved through the crowd effortlessly, nodding at people who clearly knew him but didn't dare interrupt his path. She was about to make a beeline for the bar when a voice rang out. There they are. A woman in a fitted navy gown, all perfectly styled hair and polished elegance, stepped toward them with a knowing smile. I knew it, the woman said, clearly pleased. I told you all, didn't I? Madeline blinked. Told them what? That you two were together. Madeline barely had time to process that before cameras flashed, voices murmuring, and suddenly, the gala's main topic of conversation had shifted. She turned to Julian, who, for once, actually looked surprised. And just like that, the media had their story. The ballroom was a shimmering sea of wealth and whispered speculation. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, the air thick with perfume, expensive cologne, and the kind of effortless entitlement that came from knowing money could fix anything. Madeline had spent the last hour trying not to trip over her heels, trying not to let the flashing cameras make her dizzy, and most of all, trying not to let Julian Mercer's presence next to her get under her skin. It wasn't working. The moment they had arrived, the murmurs had started. People watched them with barely concealed curiosity, whispering behind perfectly manicured hands. She had assumed it was because Julian wasn't exactly known for bringing dates to these things, let alone a woman the press couldn't identify. But when the first headline notifications started lighting up her phone, the truth became clear. Julian Mercer and mystery woman arrived together at the gala. Power couple or unexpected romance? Who is Julian Mercer's new companion? It didn't matter that she wasn't his companion. It didn't matter that she was his assistant, not his date. To them, she was a story, and the media had already written the ending. She reached for a champagne flute, determined to make it through the night without causing a scene, when a smooth, practiced voice stopped her in her tracks. Julian. She turned, coming face to face with a woman who looked like she had walked straight out of a designer campaign, sleek dark hair, high cheekbones, and the kind of icy confidence that only came from generations of old money. Isla. The name clicked into place, something Bianca had mentioned in passing when she'd been frantically trying to prepare Madeline for the gala. Isla Hawthorne. Daughter of real estate royalty. Former model. And, more importantly, rumored to have been involved with Julian at some point, though the details were murky. Isla's gaze flickered over Madeline, slow and deliberate, like she was examining something mildly interesting but ultimately unimpressive. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. How refreshing, Isla mused, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. I didn't think you were the type to bring company to these things. Madeline stiffened. Julian's expression remained unreadable. And yet, here we are. Isla's smile widened, all teeth. Yes, here we are. Though I have to say, I do admire your confidence. Madeline frowned. Excuse me? Isla tilted her head. It's just, most women in your position tend to be a little more discreet. A slow, creeping heat spread through Madeline's chest. She knew exactly what Isla was implying, but the worst part was how effortless it was, How smoothly she had woven the insult into something that sounded almost like a compliment. Madeline set down her glass with measured control. And what position would that be? Isla let out a soft, practiced laugh, the kind meant to make the other person feel small. Oh, don't be coy. I'm sure you're enjoying all of this, the attention, the headlines, the perks. Her gaze flickered toward Julian. He's generous, isn't he? Madeline's pulse pounded. She had been called a lot of things in her life. Stubborn. Difficult. Reckless. But gold digger? That was new. And it burned. Julian had been silent until now, letting the conversation unfold like he was barely interested. But suddenly, his posture shifted. He set his drink down with quiet precision, turning fully to Isla with an expression so sharp, so cutting, it made the air in the room feel heavier. Isla, he said smoothly. I know you enjoy making assumptions, but I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself. Isla blinked, thrown off by the edge in his voice. Julian continued, his tone deceptively calm. Madeline is my assistant. She's here because she's good at her job, not because she needs anything from me. He let the words settle before adding, unlike some people. Isla's expression flickered, a crack in the perfect veneer. Madeline didn't move, barely breathed. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the fact that Julian had defended her, or the fact that he had done it so casually, like it wasn't even up for debate. Isla recovered quickly, offering a small, dismissive shrug. If you say so. Julian held her gaze a second longer, then turned back to Madeline. We're leaving. It wasn't a suggestion. Madeline hesitated, then nodded once. As they walked toward the exit, the weight of the evening pressing against her, she couldn't stop the thought from creeping in. Maybe there was more to Julian Mercer than she had assumed. The gala was still replaying in Madeline's head. The flashing cameras, the murmurs, Isla's smug face twisting into shock when Julian had shut her down so effortlessly. But more than anything, it was the moment he had defended her that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just what he had said, it was the way he had said it. Like the idea of her being accused of using him was so absurd that it wasn't even worth entertaining. She almost told him that night. They had left the gala in near silence, the hum of the car the only sound between them. She had stared out the window, fingers curled against the silky fabric of Bianca's borrowed dress, her mind racing. She could have turned to him right then, could have told him the truth, could have watched the precise, controlled expression on his face shatter into something real. But she hadn't. She had looked at him, his jaw tight, his focus fixed out the window, and she had swallowed the words down like stones. Because once they were out, there would be no taking them back. By Saturday morning, she had shoved the entire thing aside. The workweek was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a full 2 days with Ivy. She had promised they'd go to the park, let her ride the carousel, buy her a hot chocolate from the tiny cafe Ivy loved because they always gave her extra whipped cream. It had been easy to get lost in the normalcy of it, to pretend that her life wasn't tangled up in impossible knots. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the beginning of fall, and Ivy had her little hands wrapped around her cup, her curls bouncing as she hopped up and down, pointing at the carousel horses. Which one are you gonna ride, baby? Madeline asked, adjusting Ivy's jacket. Ivy tapped her chin, pretending to think. The golden one. Madeline laughed. You always pick that one. Ivy grinned. Because it's the best one. Madeline shook her head fondly, leading her toward the ride, already fishing out a couple of crumpled dollar bills from her pocket. It wasn't until she had lifted Ivy onto the horse, making sure she was secure, that the strange sensation crawled up her spine. A prickling awareness, the kind that made the hairs on her arms rise. She turned her head, scanning the crowd. And then she saw him. Julian stood near the cafe entrance, dressed in dark jeans and a black coat, his sharp, unreadable gaze locked onto Ivy. Her stomach plummeted. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to know. Her body moved on instinct. She turned quickly, stepping toward the carousel, shielding Ivy with her back as if that would somehow erase what he had already seen. But it was too late. She knew it the second he started walking toward her. He didn't look furious. Not yet. But there was something simmering beneath the surface, something taut and dangerous, and for the first time, Madeline had no idea what he was going to say. The carousel started moving, Ivy's laughter ringing out, oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away. Julian stopped beside her, his voice quiet, lethal. Madeline. She didn't turn around. Madeline. She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for half a second before finally facing him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were a hurricane. His gaze flickered back to Ivy, watching as she beamed, waving at Madeline as the golden horse bobbed up and down. There was no denying it. Not the dark eyes, not the stubborn tilt of her chin, not the way she carried herself with the same quiet confidence he did. Realization settled over his features like a storm cloud. He exhaled sharply, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. Is she mine? Madeline's throat was so tight it hurt. There was no use denying it. No point in pretending anymore. Her voice barely came out. Yes. Julian's jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. How long have you known? Her chest tightened. Since the moment I found out I was pregnant. The silence between them was suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. You knew. And you never told me. I tried, she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. But you were gone. You left, Julian. You left the country, and I had no way to reach you. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. That was 6 years ago, Madeline. She swallowed hard. And by the time I found you, I convinced myself it didn't matter. His gaze was burning now. Didn't matter? She inhaled shakily. She was mine, Julian. She was my responsibility. And you, she hesitated, her voice dropping. You weren't the kind of man who stayed. Julian stared at her, his entire body taut with restrained fury. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then, finally, his voice came out cold and clipped. I want answers. Madeline tightened her arms around herself, bracing for the inevitable fallout. She had kept this secret for 6 years. Now, there was no stopping what came next. Julian sat in his office, staring blankly at the skyline. The city stretched before him in glittering lights and towering buildings, but for the first time in his life, he didn't see any of it. His entire world had just shifted, his foundation cracked beneath him. 6 years. He had a daughter for 6 years, and he hadn't known. He had missed everything, her first steps, her first words, her birthdays, the tiny moments that made up a childhood. And all because Madeline had decided he didn't deserve to know. The betrayal sat heavy in his chest. He had spent years making decisions that shaped entire industries, moving people and money with precision and control. But this had been taken from him. And he had no idea what to do with the anger curling inside him, tightening its grip every time he thought about the little girl he had unknowingly abandoned. The DNA test had confirmed what he already knew the second he saw Ivy at the park. She was his. No doubt, no question. And yet, instead of feeling victorious, instead of relief settling in, all he felt was robbed. When he confronted Madeline again, his voice had been calmer, more measured, but no less sharp. You had no right to keep this from me. Madeline's jaw had tightened, her eyes wary. And what would you have done, Julian? If I had shown up with a baby 6 years ago? He had opened his mouth, but the answer didn't come as quickly as he wanted. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He had been a different man then. A man consumed by work, by expansion, by the idea that emotions were nothing but distractions. Would he have stayed? Would he have tried? Or would he have walked away? Madeline must have seen the hesitation in his face, because she nodded slightly, as if confirming something she already believed. That's why I didn't tell you. That wasn't good enough. It would never be good enough. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to walk away now. At first, Ivy barely acknowledged him. She hid behind Madeline's legs when he visited, eyeing him with a quiet wariness that made his stomach twist. Madeline, too, kept her distance, watching him carefully, as if waiting for him to give up. He wanted to be furious with her. Some days, he still was. But more than anything, he was determined. So he did what he did best, he made a plan. He started small, making sure Ivy saw him, even if she didn't interact with him. He showed up when he said he would. He sent books when he learned she loved reading, slipping small notes inside with questions about the stories. And when he learned she had ballet practice every Wednesday, he made sure to be there, standing quietly in the back while she twirled across the studio floor, her tiny frame glowing with concentration. Slowly, it worked. One evening, after practice, she finally looked at him and asked, "Do you know how to dance?" It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. He had smiled, something small, something real. "Not like you." She had grinned, her dimples deep, her eyes shining. "I can teach you." Something in his chest cracked open. Later that week, he took them to his countryside estate, a place he had never thought of as home. It had always been an asset, a property meant for quiet business retreats or meetings with people who valued discretion. But with Ivy running across the wide-open fields, her laughter echoing, and Madeline standing beside him, arms crossed, pretending not to be impressed, it felt different. That night, as they sat by the fire, Julian turned to Madeline, his voice quieter than usual. "I regret it." She glanced at him, skeptical. "Regret what?" "Not knowing." His gaze flickered to Ivy, curled up under a blanket, already half asleep. "Not being there." Madeline was silent for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Me too." They didn't say anything else after that. The weeks passed, and Ivy's hesitation faded into something softer, something warmer. The first time she hugged him, it was quick, barely a second, but it knocked the breath out of him. And when she held on to his hand as they walked through the park, he knew he would never let go. Madeline, though, was still a different story. One evening, as Ivy slept in her room, Julian turned to her, his voice measured but certain. "You still don't trust me." Madeline sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's not that simple. Isn't it?" She let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You spent years thinking feelings were a liability, Julian. Forgive me if I'm not convinced you've suddenly changed." He didn't argue. Because she wasn't wrong. But then he said, "I love you." Her breath hitched. "What?" He took a step closer, his voice steady. "I love you, Madeline. And I love Ivy." He exhaled. "I don't want to just be in her life. I want to be in yours." Madeline searched his face, as if looking for a catch, waiting for the version of him she had once known to reappear. But he had changed. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. She swallowed, her voice hesitant. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not doing it because I have to," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm doing it because I want to." For the first time, she didn't look away. Weeks later, when Julian publicly acknowledged Ivy, shutting down any lingering questions, any doubts about his place in her life, Madeline finally believed him. And when he proposed, it wasn't grand or elaborate. It was just them, on the couch, Ivy asleep between them, and a simple question that carried more weight than any declaration ever could. She said yes. The wedding was small, intimate, filled only with the people who mattered. And as Ivy walked down the aisle as their flower girl, her grin wide and unguarded, Madeline realized something. Julian hadn't just become part of their lives. He was their family. And when Ivy ran into his arms after the ceremony, laughing as she called him Dad, Julian knew, without a doubt, that he had finally found home.